Hi, I'm Dave Samuels, and welcome to Tape 2 of Mallet Keyboard Musicianship. This tape is designed to cover in depth an approach to practicing scales and how they relate to harmony. Extensive use of accompaniment parts are utilized in order to facilitate hearing these scales in a harmonic context. You can try the same approach to practicing by getting together with other mallet players or by using a multi-track tape recorder. Each one of the scales that we're about to play are representative of both a tonal quality and a harmony. A major scale, like C major, has a unique pattern of notes with a distinctive sound, which is due to its combination of whole and half steps. As well as representing a particular sound, namely C major, it also represents a harmony. C major 6, C major 7, C major 9, and C major 6/9. So when trying to connect a scale with a particular harmony, it's always necessary to make sure that the scale and the chord fit together. Let me give you a short explanation of chord symbols. A letter name by itself refers to a major triad. A letter name followed by a minus sign refers to a minor triad. A triad either major or minor followed by a number lower than 7 refers to an added extra note above the root of the basic triad. Thus a C6 is a C major triad with an added 6th above the root. A triad followed by a number that is 7 or larger, such as 9, implies that the 7th is lowered by a half step. Thus a C9 chord is a C major triad with a lowered 7th and an added major 9th. Remember that chord symbols refer to the quality of the chord, such as major, minor, dominant, or diminished. Now let's take a look at the 7 primary scales or modes and see which scale fits with which harmony. The sound of a scale as it relates to a harmony is determined by the root triad, that is, the quality of the triad built on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees of the scale. Take, for example, a major scale or Ionian mode. The root triad of this scale is major, and so the sound quality of the scale is major. Now take the Dorian mode. The root triad of this scale is minor, and thus the quality of this scale is minor. The Phrygian mode is also minor. The Lydian mode root triad is major, so the scale quality is major. The Mixolydian mode is a little different. The root triad of this scale is major, but there's something about this scale that makes it different from the Ionian and Lydian scales. The Mixolydian mode has a major sound, but also has a lowered 7th scale degree, which makes it sound different from the other 2 scales. In a Mixolydian mode, the interval between the root and the 7th scale degree is a minor 7th interval. The change in the leading tone, or the 7th scale degree, from major in the Ionian and Lydian scales to minor in the Mixolydian scale, changes the quality of the scale from major to dominant. Thus, the Mixolydian mode has a dominant rather than just a major quality and cannot be substituted for either the Ionian or Lydian scales. The Aeolian mode is minor, and so its scale quality is minor. The Locrian mode is not major or minor, but diminished, and so its scale quality is diminished. Each of the 7 modes has a sound quality that is either major, minor, diminished, or dominant. While practicing these scales, make sure that you look at the keyboard. Scales are not only a series of notes that have a certain sound, but also represent a visual shape. Scale shape is visualized by connecting all the notes of a scale with a single line. Ideally, you want to be able to connect the sound and shape of each scale. The same process is used in language. A series of letters represents a sound that also has a meaning. This is the scale shape of a one-octave E-flat major scale. Next is the same E-flat scale starting from the lowest diatonic note on the instrument to the highest. Notice that the scale shape repeats itself every 7 notes, no matter where you start. Here's another scale shape, C natural minor. This is the same scale shape covering the whole instrument. If you compare the two scale shapes, E-flat major and C natural minor, that cover the whole instrument, you should notice that their shapes are exactly the same. You should know from your theory that an E-flat major scale and a C natural minor scale have the same key signature, and that E-flat major is the relative major of C minor, and that C minor is the relative minor of E-flat major. What you probably didn't realize is that they contain the same notes, and thus their scale shapes are exactly the same. You may have known intellectually that these two scales were similar, but as a performer, you have to know what these scales look like and sound like on your instrument. Seeing the similarities in scale shapes will help you to expand your understanding of scales. Another way of expanding your approach to playing scales is by combining them. This can be done in a number of different ways. I'll start by taking two scales that have different shapes. For example, F major and A flat major. Using a constant note value, such as eighth notes, I'll play 2 measures of F major and then 2 measures of A flat major, switching back and forth until I return to the starting note. Each time I switch from one scale to the other, I'll be starting on a different note in the scale. This type of exercise will help you to see the scale shapes more clearly, moving up and down the keyboard. It's possible to combine more than 2 different scale shapes. For example, I'll take G major, B flat major, D flat major, and E major, all dissimilar scale shapes, and connect one to the other. It's important to realize that all notes in a scale are not equal. What's meant by that is that certain notes define the quality of the scale more than others. The major pentatonic scale certainly has a major sounding quality. When starting to make up your own melodies or improvising, it's best to start by concentrating on creating the sound quality of the harmony. By emphasizing certain notes other than those that define the harmony, you'll be creating an ambiguous sound rather than one that's definitive and clear. Just because the note is in the chord scale doesn't mean that it's going to define the harmony. Another way to look at this is to realize that certain notes have a static or resting quality, whereas other notes have a more kinetic or active quality. The notes of the root triad sound static relative to the harmony, whereas the other notes in the scale have varying degrees of a kinetic or active quality. The fourth, sixth, and second degrees of the major scale have an active quality that wants to resolve, in general, to a more static note. The same active quality is also true of the 5 other notes not contained in the scale. In the key of C major, they would be C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. Each one of these notes also has a high degree of activity and wants to resolve to some kind of static note. Even though we're only talking about chord scales, it's important to understand that when improvising, every note works everywhere all the time. It's a 12-tone system. The artful improviser can use any note anywhere and make it sound totally natural and yet very definitive of the harmony, because there's a thorough understanding of how to resolve these active non-chord tones into more static chord tones. There are many different scales other than the ones that have been dealt with thus far. One of these is the pentatonic scale. It's a 5-note scale that has many different varieties. At first, we'll deal with the major pentatonic scale, which is derived from the major scale. You can also combine different major pentatonic scales, as we have before with the major and minor scales. As with other scales, the major pentatonic has a particular scale shape that you should become aware of as you practice. Another major sounding scale is the Lydian mode. This scale sounds like a major scale with a raised 4th degree. The half steps in this scale are between scale degrees 4 and 5 and 7 and 8. Notice that the root triad of this scale is major and that this chord scale can be a substitution for a major chord scale. There's also a Lydian pentatonic scale that is based upon the essential elements of the complete scale. Now let me combine both the major and Lydian scales and their pentatonics and create melodies over the following progression of major chords. The Mixolydian scale is another very important scale. It's major in quality, but has a lowered seventh degree that gives it its unique sound that separates it from the other major sounding scales, namely the Ionian and Lydian scales. The Mixolydian scale has half steps between scale degrees 3 and 4 and 6 and 7. There's also a Mixolydian pentatonic scale that consists of scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. Listen to how this pentatonic sounds over the same example. The Dorian mode is the most commonly used chord scale for minor chords. The scale has half steps between scale degrees 2 and 3 and 6 and 7. The root triad of this scale is minor. The scale is used often in traditional 2 minor 7 5 7 progressions. The 2 minor 7 chord would usually be a Dorian scale. Listen to the scale in the following example. There's also a Dorian pentatonic scale consisting of scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. I'll use the Dorian pentatonic scale over the previous example. The Aeolian or natural minor scale is traditionally the first minor scale we learn when studying music. It differs from the Dorian scale in that the 6th scale degree is lowered in the Aeolian mode. This one-note difference gives this scale its unique quality. There's also an Aeolian pentatonic scale that consists of scale degrees 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7. Listen to this pentatonic scale over the following example. Now let me take both the Aeolian and Dorian scales along with their pentatonics and combine them to create melodies over the following progression of minor chords. Yet another minor sounding scale is the Phrygian mode. This scale differs from the Dorian and Aeolian scales because of its construction. There are half steps between scale degrees 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. It's the half step between the root and the second scale degree that gives this scale its unique sound quality. Listen to this scale as I play over the following example. There's also a pentatonic that is derived from this scale. It contains scale degrees 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7. Listen to this scale over the same example. The Locrian scale is the only diatonic scale whose root triad is diminished rather than major or minor, like the other scales. This scale has half steps between scale degrees 1 and 2 and 4 and 5. Listen to the scale over the following example. There's also a pentatonic scale derived from this scale. It contains scale degrees 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7. Listen to this scale over the same example. This completes the discussion of scales and how they relate to harmony. Now let's apply some of this knowledge in a playing environment with some other types of progressions that combine different chord qualities. The only addition that I'd like to make to what you already know concerns dominant chords. When playing over dominant chords, there are alterations that can be utilized to make these chord scales more colorful. You can use alterations of the ninth, both raised and lowered, and alterations of the fifth. There are a number of altered dominant chord scales that are commonly used. The most common one of these scales is the symmetrical diminished or half-step whole step scale. As its name implies, this 8-note scale is played by alternating between a half step and a whole step. Listen to the way this scale sounds. The altered notes of the dominant chord scale are used for color and are generally resolved into a chordal tone of the following chord, or chord of resolution, like in the example 5, 7 to 1. Dominant chords that resolve to a major chord can either use a mixolydian scale or an altered scale, but dominant chords that resolve to a minor chord usually use an altered scale rather than a mixolydian scale. Listen to the following progression and take special notice of the difference in the sound between a resolution to a minor chord versus a resolution to a major chord. Now let's start applying some of these new ideas. Listen to the following progressions and take special notice as to how I'm moving from one chord to the other.